fun happens when we can talk about what you want to talk about, and if you want, you can pick my brain or I can keep talking. I'm going to start with, I think, the biggest thing that's been happening the past few days, and the biggest potential for freedom after COVID-19, and that's in education. And as I'm sure you all know, Governor Herbert has issued his centrally planned top-down solution of masks for everyone in K through 12 schools, even in rural schools that are in the green and whatever color coding they're using now. Even though kids are basically perfectly safe from COVID-19 and they don't transmit it, they don't get it, that has been the best marketing program for homeschooling that I can ever imagine. I homeschool my children. I am a product of public school, by the way. Sorry, I jumped in too soon. Let me maybe share a little bit more about myself so you have, I guess if you're here, maybe you already know a little bit about me, but Libertas Institute was started in 2011. It's a think tank, it's a 501c3 nonprofit. Think tank is basically, well, if you've heard of the term think tank before, I always like to call think tanks mental institutions, because a think tank, anyways. So we basically sit around all day trying to brainstorm how to change the law, in our case, in favor of freedom. There are think tanks that, are like Democrat socialist think tanks, and they're trying to figure out how to, oppress us every day. We spend our days trying to figure out how to become more free, how we can build campaigns, how we can persuade people in power to adopt the reforms that we're proposing. We've been at that for about 8 years. We've changed at this point, I think, 60 some odd laws, big and small. And we had a lot of fun along the way. We got a staff of about 12 people at this point. Well, actually more. I think we're at like 15 or 16 now. And yeah, that's our full-time job. I call myself a full-time freedom fighter. Along the way, because we homeschool, and I've got 2 young kids, when they were younger, about 5 years ago, I would find myself coming home to want to talk to my kids about what they did while I was gone and share with them what I did while I was at work. And I found myself struggling to figure out how to communicate to my young children what the heck I did all day. Like, how do you explain eminent domain to an 8-year-old, right? Or democratic socialism to a 6-year-old. It was kind of tough. So I went on Amazon and I was like, hey, there's got to be some books, right? Because we're doing the birds and the bees conversation. There's like 83 books about that on Amazon. Like, I'm like, here, just read this. I don't want to talk to you about that. Read that and then we'll talk when we're done. I'm like, clearly something as important as free market economics or property rights or whatever, right? There's got to be books about this, and there wasn't. And so thus the Tuttle Twins was born. So yeah, fast forward 5 years later, Libertas is doing great. We're passing a bunch of laws. We're now exporting our work to other states, working with groups like ours in other states. And the Tuttle Twins is, how many here have read or bought or know about Tuttle Twins? Is that so about third, half, 2/3, something like that? So I didn't bring any. I was going to bring some instead. So if you go to TuttleTwins.com, and if you want to pick them up for the kids or grandkids, so we got a prop up here. If you use the coupon code STG, right? Isn't that St. George? If you use the coupon code STG, then you'll get half off, and you just have them shipped to you, so that I didn't have to lug a bunch of. I'm already a little sweaty. So if you're interested in Tuttle Twins books, just go to TuttleTwins.com. You can grab some there. It's bonkers right now. So COVID, just to give you a little insight into my world. Before COVID, we were selling about 1,200 books a day, which is a lot. Most authors sell like 500. The average across all books ever that an average author would do is about 500 copies of their book. Because most books sell 5 copies or 20 copies, and then you got some that sell like millions. Before COVID, we were selling about 1,200 a day. Right now, we're selling 4,000 books every single day. Tons of people wanting to homeschool, right? Tons of people fed up with what they're seeing around them. And so it seems like a perfect opportunity. So which leads us back to that first language education. So the governor issues this statewide mandate. What was really interesting, our organization, education is one of the big areas of focus. And we've been monitoring this really closely, talking with policymakers and principals and school board officials, trying to figure out what the fall is going to look like in terms of public school, right? And even private school to some extent. And we've been planning on doing a poll to try and figure out what parents are going to do in the fall across Utah, right? How many were doing public versus homeschool, charter school, private school last year, and then what does that look like next year? So we're trying to figure out, okay, when's the right time to do a poll? When should we kind of get our finger on the pulse of where the public stands? And then along with that, just literally 4 hours before Governor Herbert made his announcement, my team and I were in a meeting, and we were planning a campaign for how to encourage more people to opt out of the system, how to encourage more people to homeschool. We were going to do a billboard. We had a website name put together. I met with the Harmon brothers, if you know who they are, the big marketing agency. They're doing a Teletoons cartoon with us. So we were having a meeting about the cartoon, and we were talking about this, like how to do marketing to kind of get people out of the system and just say, avoid the craziness, let's homeschool for real, not the like experiment parents were forced into a few months ago that wasn't like true homeschooling. So anyways, we're hatching this big campaign, let's do this. And then the governor comes out with his press conference and announces the mask. And I kid you not, I mean, my social media lit up. I had so many people messaging me saying, how do I homeschool? I'm like, I don't need to put a billboard up anymore. They're coming to me, right? And all these, my wife put together a meeting for just people in our neighborhood. Another lady across the town put a big meeting together. Boom, 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 boom. All across social media, all these people start reaching out. And what was really interesting about that is there have been 3 national polls in the past, I'd say 3 months. All of them show more than 30% of parents intend to homeschool in the fall. Now, all 3 of these polls they're at least a month old, which means they predate any of these mask mandates and some of these other things happening. So you gotta wonder what that's gonna do to the numbers. And I always think, okay, well, it's one thing to say, yeah, I'm gonna homeschool. It's another thing to like actually do it, right? For those of you who homeschool, you know what I mean. And so even like if 30%, one poll said 60% of parents, right? That's insane. And if you assume that even a fraction of that amount are actually going to do it, that is tripling, quintupling, sextupling, like I don't know all those fancy words, just massively increasing the number of homeschoolers. And so as problematic as so much of this is, to me education is the biggest silver lining right now to disrupt the stale, archaic, antiquated education system that's full of so much inertia. Those of us on the outside have been trying to like poke at it saying, hey, innovate. You need to catch up with the 21st century. You need more parental rights. You need to adapt. And oh my gosh, like for all the negatives with COVID, I think we're going to see a transformation of the education system. Now there are risks. There's a lot of risks. For example, the massive influx of homeschooling could lead a lot of control freaks to want to then regulate homeschooling. We helped change the law a few years ago in Utah to the point where now homeschooling is literally like freedom. There's no mandates, there's no curriculum requirements, there's no tests, there's no accountability, and of course the control freaks don't like that. They want all those things. We gotta make sure that Connor is properly trained to teach his children. We need to administer tests, and so I anticipate there's going to be some type of response like that. There's also going to be, so we're pushing for an income tax credit in Utah as long as there's no strings attached, because it's insane that I, as a homeschooling father, have to first pay for other people's children, and then with whatever money I have left over after my income tax, then I get to pay for my own kids' education expenses. And so we're going to be pushing for that in the next legislative session. We did it a few years ago, very narrowly failed, but after COVID, when all these people are homeschooling, it's a totally different ballgame. And so that conversation is going to happen in the legislature just to fix or try and address that financial injustice of not just homeschoolers, but private schoolers as well, where you have actual out-of-pocket expenses. It's crazy to be supporting other people's kids while also directly paying for your own. So that's something that is absolutely going to be fixed. But I'll tell you, the schools are struggling. As we talk to people behind the scenes, I don't know what it's like in southern Utah, but more up in my neck of the woods. As we've been talking with some of the folks putting these plans together, it is not going to be pretty. I don't know if any of y'all have kids or grandkids in public school, but masks, social distancing, sanitizing everything, temperature checks all the time. It basically is something out of a dystopian film to see what this is going to be like in some of these classrooms. And so they're going to try. Schools are required by August 1st to announce their plans of how they're going to do this. And a lot of people want the schools to reopen, but I anticipate that either they're going to fully close again if the case numbers continue to go up, or that so many parents are going to be like, this is not working, right? They're going to try because they want to go back to work and they want the free babysitting and whatever. They sincerely think that that's the best thing for their child. They give it a try and they're like, okay, my kid's miserable. He's not really learning anything. Let's try something else. So I'm actually excited to see the disruption in education. I think this is going to accelerate a lot of the potential innovation in education than far faster than what we would otherwise see. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, specifically in the education arena. I think I wrote down 5 things that I wanted to bring up to make sure that we cover it. That was the first one. Okay, the second one that probably a lot of people in this room are concerned about is, I'll call it bodily autonomy. Right? There's a lot of concern about like a vaccine mandate, right? If there's a COVID vaccine, if you really get into the science, it appears, I'm no scientist, but I'm trying to keep up with layman's terms and trying to read everything. It appears that COVID-19 has already mutated at least once from the initial strain that came out, which is why you're now seeing articles coming out about people who had it being able to get it again. Right? And just like the flu, there's always a different strain. And so in fact, when you get a flu shot, for those of you who do, maybe in this room there's like one person who gets a flu shot, I don't know. But if you ever get a flu shot, the people who are developing the flu shot, they're literally guessing at what strain of influenza is going to be the prevalent one because it mutates, right? That's just how it works. And so it appears that that's happening to the extent I understand it with COVID already. Nevertheless, there are several companies trying to manufacture a vaccine, and there's a lot of concern in a lot of quarters that this is going to be something that's mandated. I see some head nodding, so maybe that's a concern that some of y'all share in here. Now, in the state of Utah, at present, there are no mandatory vaccines for adults. The way they do it, as I'm sure you all know, is the public school kids. That is kind of the vector that they use to broadly inoculate, they say immunize, which I think is always silly because it doesn't actually provide immunity. Sometimes it does, often it doesn't. But that's the vector at which they're able to vaccinate a bunch of the population to try and manufacture herd immunity. Now, they're going to have a very tough time, I think, in a massive fight if there's any effort to do a mandatory vaccine. I'll tell you from my conversations up on the Hill, that is a non-starter. So I don't personally share the fear that there's going to be any kind of like society-wide or statewide or whatever mandatory vaccine. What's likely to happen is that it's just another vaccine administered to children who want to attend public school, for which exemptions do exist, right? Those of you with kids in school, maybe you've done this exemption from the vaccinations. You can have a religious exemption, which is often harder to get because they want you to point to specific things in your religion that say that you object to vaccines. And for those of us who kind of share the predominant religion in the state, they kind of tend to lean the other way in a pro-vaccination thing. However, Utah does have a personal exemption, and so you can opt your child out of these vaccines. Of course, this is another reason to homeschool, if you're at all concerned about this, because that requirement is not there. But I anticipate that there is going to be an effort to try and require school children. That's going to be how they'll say, we'll safely reopen the schools and we can get rid of the masks and so forth. What's always funny to me about the vaccine debate, and this is a little bit tangential, is that for all the people complaining about, everyone has to get vaccinated, when I'm having these debates online with my friends who are my age, and I finally get around to asking them, you've gotten all your booster shots, right? To which they 100% of the time reply and say, well, no. And then I say, then you're not vaccinated. Why are you so concerned about your kids when you're not even vaccinated either? You haven't kept up on the booster shots. Hardly anyone does. The booster shot, I should stand in front of that. The booster shot, what do you call it, adoption rate, or the number of adults who get it is pathetically low. And so this notion of herd immunity isn't really there. Anyways, bodily autonomy, I think that's another area of concern. We're seeing it to some extent now, I think, with masks. I think mandatory masks is a function of bodily autonomy. They're saying you must behave this way, you must act this way, you must do this to or with your body. And so it's not as invasive of a vaccine, but I think it is a little bit of a stepping stone in terms of limiting bodily autonomy for the government to say if you want to come to school, or if you want to come to the DMV, or if you want to go to the liquor store, right? Any kind of interaction with the state government, they're starting to mandate this. Of course, private businesses are doing this. My wife is kind of sad. She shops at Smith's, and Smith's just announced this morning that they are requiring masks. Costco, Walmart, Target, and all these guys are following like dominoes. I will say this, I have repeatedly been pushing back on social media in the past few days against the governor's team, because when he gets up in these press conferences, and in the past few days specifically, continues to assert, and I don't know if any of you have kind of seen the summary or watched them, but the governor twice now, including today, and the last one I believe was, Thursday, it might have been like Monday or well, let's see, when did he announce the mask mandate? That was like last Friday, I think, Thursday or Friday. So it's when he announced that, and then today, he's twice stood up and he says, I have the authority to issue a statewide mask mandate, I'm just choosing not to. Last time when he announced it, the first time he announced it, he specifically said that the 10th Amendment authorizes him to issue a statewide mask mandate. To which I want to say, back where our prop is, Governor Herbert, here's a Tuttle Twins book. Let's get you some basic understanding of what the Bill of Rights does and does not say. The 10th Amendment does not confer any authority on the governor. It simply says that all powers not delegated to the federal government are reserved to the states or to the people. That doesn't say, oh, governor, and as long as you declare an emergency, which is your sole discretion, you then get to become a dictator and do whatever you want. And no, the 10th Amendment does not say that as long as you issue an emergency, you can boss people around. It doesn't say that at all. The governor only has the authority conferred upon him in the Utah Constitution and in state law. That's it. The governor he has a limited defined set of powers in the state constitution and in the state law. I've read all of the areas in both of those that pertain to the governor's authority, including under the Emergency Management Act, which is kind of the powers that are triggered when he declares an emergency, right? And there's nothing in there that says that he can do what a mask mandate is. He can order the government around, which is why he safely and I'll say constitutionally or legally can say, if you want to come to the DMV or if you want to come to the liquor store, which should be privatized, but that's a government thing right now. Or if you want to come to government schools and so on and so forth, you have to have the mask. He is within his authority to do that. But for him to say, as so many are pressuring him to do right now, especially all our friends on the left, this is oddly, weirdly partisan, where many get into the bigger conversation and you really think that this is all about trying to defeat Trump, and they're trying to hang all this around the neck of Trump, which is why the leftist governors are the ones going crazy. California just shut everything back down again in a couple days. I'm a former California person, so I'm in exile like so many of my friends. Permanent exile, by the way. However, the governor does not have authority to issue a statewide mask mandate. He may try, and I'll tell you that we are in discussions with attorneys who, on their own initiative, not ours, but we're talking to them, are planning litigation, a lawsuit, against such an order should it arise. There are also some conversations about potential legal action to prevent mask mandates in schools. However, I think a lawsuit on that issue is on shakier ground because that's a government thing, and so I think he's more legally sound in doing that. Also, I don't know that the mask mandate is going to last very long. A lot of you either have or have recently had young children. Requiring them to wear a face diaper for 6 hours a day is not going to be very successful. They're going to touch it, they're going to move it, they're going to trade it with other friends. Yours has Pokemon. Oh, hey, mine is right? This stuff is not going to work very well. We know how children are. Why do we expect that they're going to be submissive and compliant and sit there and not play with their face diaper? I used that term in an op-ed the other day in the Deseret News, and my mom texted me after and said, I'm using that term from now on, face diaper. It's excellent. All right, Mom. So the governor is on the cusp of doing it. He said last week that if the numbers, if the case numbers go above whatever he said, 500 or 800, then I may, reconsider. And so he continues to proclaim and reserve to himself the authority to issue a statewide mandate. I will say that as much as I and many of us would probably object to a statewide mandate, under state law, the local public health officials have near dictatorial powers during a public health emergency. When a pandemic is declared, when an emergency is declared, current state law written decades ago, back when they used to write very broadly and they didn't know what they were doing very well, not to besmirch the wisdom of our forefathers, but this particular law that was written decades ago is horrible. It literally basically just says public health officials can issue whatever orders they want that are in furtherance of public health. Like, broadly speaking, sir.
So all state law, statute law has to be pursuant of the state constitution and also compatible with the U.S. Constitution. Where in the state constitution makes that law legal?
Great question, and feel free to interrupt anyone else. Interrupt me with questions. I'm a very informal person, so don't feel like you need to wait till the end. So thank you for the question. The question was, I'll repeat for those in the back. The question was stated that state law has to be pursuant to and consistent with the state constitution and the United States Constitution. So where in either of those constitutions does this authority exist for these local health officials that we're talking about? Now, this is the awkward thing about the state constitution. If you've read it recently, good for you. If you haven't, I wouldn't recommend it. I call the Utah Constitution an uninspired and uninspiring document. It's, it is what it is. Cobweb I'm walking through. This is an authentic, barn. This is great. All right, getting the full experience here. Now, the problem with state constitutions is that they are basically the inverse of the U.S. Constitution, and this is a huge problem. The U.S. Constitution, like the 10th Amendment says that we just said, we delegate, or our forefathers, delegated to the federal government certain explicit powers, right? And then they wrote the Constitution, and then there was this big debate about the Bill of Rights. Do we need it? Do we not need it? There was this whole question of are these 10 amendments necessary? And there were a lot of people who worked on the original Constitution and said, we don't need those. That, the Constitution clearly only delegates certain powers. Can you imagine America in 2020 without the First Amendment and the Second Amendment? I think we'd be okay with the Third Amendment. I don't think we have soldiers being quartered in any of our homes recently. But the Fourth Amendment, holy cow! I mean, the NSA and everything they're doing on our phones, and Fifth Amendment, eminent domain, I just can't even imagine what America would be like and the growth of government without the Bill of Rights. Okay, so I say my prayers. I say, thank you for the Bill of Rights, because without it, we'd be Russia. However, the question, I think, hinges more on the Utah Constitution, because the United States Constitution does not give any power to the state or to the local health officials or anyone. It just says, hey, federal government, in theory, you can only have these powers to be delegated. Everything else we're reserving to ourselves here in Utah, right? That's kind of the how a bill becomes a law, the third grade civics, tutorial of how compact union exists. Okay, so the problem is that in states, the application is actually in reverse for the Constitution. The state constitution can forbid certain things on the part of government, but it's presumed under the so-called plenary power doctrine, plenary meaning plentiful, abundant, total, absolute, that the state legislature can do whatever it wants unless it is forbidden from doing so in the Utah Constitution. So whereas the U.S. Constitution, in theory, says, hey, federal government, you can only do X, Y, and Z, and if it's not in the United States Constitution, you can't do it, again, theoretically. Under the Utah Constitution, it's, hey, state legislature, you can pass whatever law you want, as long as, the courts have, not said it's unconstitutional, whatever, but you can do whatever you want unless the state constitution says you can't. Do you see how that works in the reverse? One is delegating a limited number of powers, the other is just forbidding certain things, but then everything else is on the table, which is why the state legislature can come around and say, oh, we're going to pass this law that public health officials can have near dictatorial powers during times of emergency. Okay, so all that to be said, there is a strong appetite in the legislature to restrict that authority now that we've discovered for the first time how it's being used. We haven't really lived through a pandemic since that statute was passed. We haven't seen local health officials being so brazen as they have been, and mayors shutting things down. And so there is a strong appetite, and we're part of those conversations to try and identify all of the problematic statutes that are being relied upon and put some serious guardrails around them so that these health department officials and mayors and so forth cannot just do whatever they please. There has to be legislative oversight, there has to be public hearings, there has to be time limits, right? There has to be particularity. In other words, the orders have to be narrow. The biggest problem with this whole thing, well, not the biggest, there are a lot of big problems with this thing. One big problem with this thing is if you understand the Fourth Amendment or criminal law, we are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. We're all familiar with that, right? You've watched, NCIS or CSI or whatever these shows are. I would say 24. Do you remember the Jack Bauer show? I used to be really into that back before I understood the Constitution and law and stuff. And here was this guy who would just go around killing people and no due process, and it was all great because he was, trying to save people theoretically. Anyways, I don't recommend that show. It's not very good. So I used to love it. What was I even saying before? Okay, we're presumed innocent until proven guilty. We have a presumption of innocence, and so we can basically do whatever we want until we're proven guilty of a certain. The biggest, again, I keep using superlatives, not the biggest. One of the biggest problems right now in COVID, from my estimation, is that we are all presumed, I'll put air quotes around this, guilty of having COVID-19. We're all presumed to be infectious and thus subject to quarantine. Right? Quarantine is for sick people. Quarantine is, hey, we've identified Larry over here in the corner, right? He's looking very sickly. I can take his temperature with my remote gun, right? He's got a high temperature. Okay, now we're going to narrowly quarantine Larry because he's sick and make sure that he doesn't spread. That, as much as they might not like it, that's at least appropriate because it's narrowly tailored to someone who's been specifically identified as being a potential problem. Public health, right? We want to make sure in this example that Larry doesn't spread to other people, and so there's at least a reasonable basis to say the government can quarantine Larry to save all of you over here. There's at least reasonableness there. We might quibble with that. We might, Larry might not like being in a bubble and having to, order everything on Amazon and watch Netflix all day, but the government can at least get away with doing something like that. The problem becomes when the government says, well, I don't know if any of you are sick, but you might be. So we're going to quarantine all of you. And you can't gather with more than X number of people, and you have to wear a mask, and you have to do all these things. We're going to boss you around. That's where the government really starts to lose its footing. And so, as I said, these attorneys that we're talking to are basically waiting for the governor to try. And when he does, there may be, some kind of legal showdown. So, back to bodily autonomy, vaccinations. Yeah, maybe. I mean, honestly, there may be no vaccine. There's some being developed. There's some being fast-tracked. But it's quite possible that there is no COVID-19 vaccine that comes out, even though a lot of people are anticipating that. So there may not be a mandate. Just like with the flu shot, I mean, it's understood that it's not guaranteed and therefore it's not mandated kind of thing. We're all propagandized into getting it because there's a whole industry built around our compliance with getting the flu shot. There's a lot of money to be had, but the government at least isn't mandating it, and I anticipate that COVID will be something a little similar. Okay, related to what I just said a moment ago with the public health officials, there's going to be legislation to try and limit executive authority. I can think of no bigger problems to our freedom than having one person being able to issue this statewide mandate of his own accord and modify the behavior and control the actions of, how many are we in Utah? 3 million? I don't even know. 3 million? Something like that. So there's going to be several pieces of legislation trying to restrict the authority of the governor, which is always awkward because then he has to sign the bill. And we're going to have a new governor, unless Huntsman tries to mount his, writing campaign. It's going to be Governor Cox. And so there's going to be legislation trying to restrict the power of the governor and the local government officials and the public health officials as well. So that, I think, is something that seriously needs to be addressed, because if we are wading into an area where the government can dictate on presumably guilty people like that, we're running into serious problems, and at a minimum, the legislature has to have oversight so that all of us, through our, quote unquote representatives, can try and speak out and speak our mind. Yes, sir.
Do they really have to limit his power, or can they not just have a resolution say you have no such power? It's slightly different.
Great question. The question was, do they have to actually limit his power, or can they pass a resolution saying you don't have the power? They could pass a resolution. A resolution, it has the same legal effect of sneezing. So it's just a mother may I and a fart in the wind, and that's basically it. So they would have to pass a law explicitly, because the governor, think if you're the executive, you have all this power, and you're going to do what you think is best. And you're going to find every opportunity with your, folks on your staff to wiggle around. Oh, but that doesn't quite say this way, so we can get around it by doing, right? They have to be very explicit and go in there in very, minute detail and say you can't do this, you can only do this. Here's when you can do that. And so that's the route that they're going to have to go to micromanage executive authority. I think there was a hand over here, or maybe not. Yes, ma'am.
Actually, is anyone challenging those numbers in regards to cases? Because I've heard that they're kind of played with, and it's across the world, actually. Is anyone stepping up to the plate on this?
So the question was, is anyone pushing back on the count of cases and deaths? I think one of the main allegations is that they overcount deaths and say, oh, grandpa died in his sleep, but he had COVID, and so we're going to count it as a COVID death and that type of thing. So in Utah, I don't think that challenge exists, and I try and ignore national news as much as possible for reasons I'll get into in just a moment. I will say, however, in today's press conference, when they announced numbers for the number of cases of COVID-19, they included, I'm going to get the word wrong, I think they included the antigen tests for the first time. I was reading on Twitter when they were doing the press conference, which significantly boosted the number of cases because they're basically adding a bunch of numbers from this other type of testing. And they admitted, okay, hey, this is going to cause a spike in numbers, and it shouldn't be perceived that the numbers are here. And then they shot up, oh my gosh, let's all panic. They were at least kind of tempering it down, saying, well, we just hadn't been counting those cases before, and now we are, so it jumped up. But in Utah, there's not really anyone pushing back like that, and I honestly don't know to what extent the data is accurate or not, and how over-inclusive it is. The biggest, I keep saying the biggest, I like my superlative. So one of the issues that I have is how the goalposts keep changing, right? At first it's, let's flatten the curve, and then let's crush the curve, and now it's let's all hide until a vaccine comes around, and we're going to be able to avoid this because, magic? I don't know. And everyone's dying in the streets. Oh, wait a minute, now the death rate is cratering to near zero, so let's not pay attention to the death rate, and let's look over here at the number of cases. To which I say, don't we want the number of cases to increase while death is going down? Because that means the risk per case is so insignificant that means that we're, whether it's herd immunity or, it's a mutated version of less, whatever. I don't know the science there, but it gets very frustrating, I think, for those of us kind of consuming the media and trying to figure out what's going on, to see them kind of point our attention there. Don't look at the death rate now. We're not going to talk about, there's good news over here. The death rate's going down. Focus on the bad news. And to which I call this panic porn. Everyone just is addicted to panic. They're addicted to fear. It induces this dopamine drip effect where people are just okay, maybe I'll jump to this now. So in the back, I brought a copy of Feardom that I wrote a few years ago. You're welcome to take one. Writing this book was really depressing because from a marketing standpoint and an author standpoint, I'm I'm going to sell a ton of these books. This is going to be great. Why? Because this topic is never not going to be relevant. So subtitle is How Politicians Exploit Your Emotions and What You Can Do to Stop Them. It was written in 2014, so 6 years ago, and catalogs a lot of historically how this happens over and over and over and over again. And I'm man, this happens so much. This book's, it's just going to keep happening, and so I'm always going to be able to say, hey, this book is very relevant to what's going on today. And that's certainly the case with today, where it's almost like people, back in the day it was soap operas, right? Those were the big thing, and then telenovelas, and if you're, Latin culture or whatever, and then reality TV, and then I think like we all watched all the reality TV on Netflix, and there isn't anything new, and so we're just addicted to like the drama of like real life now, where bad news and drama like gives us that steady dopamine drip I don't know. But anyways, take a look if you want. I think it's unfortunately extremely relevant to what's happening today. All right, I think one or two more, and then we can open this to more questions. Social justice, white guilt. There was, I gotta pull this up. So one of the people who worked for me sent me this link. And I've got 2% battery, so let's see if this sticks with me. All right, here's this graphic. This was going around social media today. Aspects and assumptions of whiteness in white culture in the United States. White dominant culture, or whiteness, refers to the ways white people and their traditions, attitudes, and ways of life have been normalized over time and are now considered standard practices in the United States. And since white people still hold most of the institutional power in America, we have all internalized some aspects of white culture, including people of color. And it goes on to point out all of the problems associated with what they call white culture. Therefore, things that if we think Black Lives Matter, we need to oppose this whiteness, which includes rugged individualism, self-reliance, independence and autonomy, family structure, including the nuclear family. By the way, if you want to be freaked out, go look up the organization Black Lives Matter and go to their About page and see what they actually stand for. Literally, it's a bunch of Marxists. Husbands being the breadwinner and head of the household, children having their own rooms, be independent. I'm sorry, white kids, you're not allowed to apparently have your own rooms anymore. Because that has to do with, Little House on the Prairie. I don't know. Didn't they all share one bed or something? But emphasis on the scientific method, objective, rational, linear thinking. Like this is a problem. Cause and effect relationships. History based on Northern European immigrants' experience in the United States, with a heavy focus on the British Empire and the primacy of Western, Greek, Roman, and Judeo-Christian traditions. They also associate with whiteness the Protestant work ethic, including hard work being the key to success. And then, let's see, one more. A few more. Religion is there as well. No tolerance for deviation from single God concept. Status, power, and authority. Associating wealth with a person's worth. Respecting authority is considered whiteness. Heavy value on ownership of goods, space, and property. Let's see. Time, following rigid time schedules is whiteness. Time being viewed as a commodity. Holidays based on Christian religions, based on white history and male leaders. Justice being based on English common law, protecting property. Counting intent, which, man, if you have a background in criminal law, it's crazy that you're trying to go after that. Anyways, they go on. My point is that I shared this with a few folks earlier. Before 9/11, there was a group called Project for a New American Century. Anyone heard of that name before? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, do you have? Oh, that'd be amazing. Lifesaver. Except that's the wrong. Yeah, that's okay. I'll be all right. Thank you, though. I appreciate the offer. So, the Project for a New American Century was this like think tanky kind of organization in the late 90s that got together. And it was a bunch of people like in government and academia, public policy, and they were neoconservatives. These are people who support like military intervention abroad and so forth. And they got together and they put together this white paper, this document that was like their stated beliefs. And that's basically all they did. This organization really only existed for issuing this one paper. It was kind of bizarre. But they issued this paper. This is before 9/11, I believe by 2 years, if I'm remembering right. But it was definitely before 9/11. In which, in this white paper, they talked about the need to galvanize the American public in support of foreign intervention, military intervention, for which they needed, and I quote, a new Pearl Harbor. if you remember the original Pearl Harbor and what that did in terms of the military and public zeitgeist and attitudes and so forth, here they were calling for a new Pearl Harbor, which lo and behold, soon arrived. And I'm not suggesting or here to debate or get into whether 9/11 was a conspiracy. The point is, 9/11 happened, and there were people waiting in the wings, ready to exploit the sentiments and fear of the American public in pursuit of a specific foreign policy goal. Okay? That's amazing. People are resourceful. Never let anyone tell you that people in southern Utah are not prepared. Except I'm not. All right. Thank you. Maybe we turn on. There we go. All right. Now I can get peace. This is I'm like an invisible umbilical cord attached to this thing. If it doesn't work, I start to sweat. I'm already sweating now. Okay. So, Project for a New American Century, 9/11, and here we go. Those very people involved in writing that white paper are now in positions of power in the Bush administration to implement their goals. Okay? Now we have people talking about social justice and white guilt and racism and Black Lives Matter, which I agree with, and yet they think something totally different, and racial inequality and the need for restorative justice or restitution because my ancestors suffered, therefore I'm going to steal from you and I'm going to benefit, and like all this nonsense. But these people stand ready to implement their designs because of what is happening right now. We sent an email out today to our list talking about this great reset concept that a lot of people in global government are talking about, wanting to specifically leverage what is happening right now in the chaos and the uncertainty, economically, racially, socially, in order to have a massive transformation of our antiquated, racist, capitalist system to, inject social justice, right, into this equation. Social justice is basically just communism. And by the way, so we've been doing a bunch of ads lately for the Tuttle Twins. Part of the reason why we're selling so much is that we came out with some new ads. And the one that's performing the best, it's this square, and it's like a split image, right? So there's like a little rectangle on top and a little on the bottom, and it says problem, solution. Pretty simple concept, right? So the image at the top is Karl Marx, and the image at the bottom is just some cute kids reading Tuttle Twins books. And so now you got all these people scrolling past and oh, Karl Marx, ooh, I need those books, and it's working really well. Because we need to inoculate these children against this, political virus that we have. Okay, so social justice is going to be a big problem. Rahm Emanuel, Barack Obama's buddy, you'll remember, Chicago mayor, he's now infamous for having used the line, you never want to let a good crisis go to waste. And you're all nodding your head, but I would suggest you pick up this book in the back. Why? Because you will read things such as the declassified Operation Northwoods. Anyone ever heard of that? Maybe a couple of you. Operation Northwoods, which was a proposal by the United States military top brass, Joint Chiefs of Staff, who during the whole Cuban Missile Crisis and all the tensions in Cuba and everything, went to the president at the time, who was John F. Kennedy, and they literally proposed, this is all classified, but it's been declassified, which is why I don't know about it. They go up to the president in this plan, and they specifically propose attacking Americans, killing Americans, bombing Americans, downing boats of Americans, blaming it all on Cubans, as a way to incite the American public to have an attitude of wanting to go intervene in Cuba so that they can then stave off communism and pursue all these noble goals. And yet here was the American military literally calling for the assassination of Americans. And the only reason that didn't happen is because JFK said no. Right? So trying to exploit emotions for political benefit is something we're seeing, I think, play out in absolute real time. So pick up the book. All right. Last one, I believe. Let's see. All right. Is okay. There's a few more. I'll be quick about these so we get into more Q&A. The ratcheting effect. We're working on a Tuttle Twins book right now, our 12th in the series, based on a book called Crisis and Leviathan. Leviathan is like this, easiest way to say it is it represents big government. And so in times of crisis, as is mentioned in this book, for example, crisis will be exploited in terms of growing the government. And Bob Higgs, who wrote that book, talked about a ratcheting effect. He says, think about 9/11, right? Now we have the TSA, and it's just normal that we're groped all the time when we go flying. We're just, used to it and standing in the scanner and so forth. The ratcheting effect is the new normal. That's the term that we have right now, right? This is the new normal. Now we'll acclimatize to that, and then there will be a new normal. And it's the ratcheting effect where if you know how the ratchet works, right? It goes in one direction, and then you go back, and then you can do it some more and some more. And that's what we see in government. During these times of crisis, the government always and inevitably grows. And so we have to understand what our rights are, and we have to be on guard. My next door neighbor lives here and I live here and here's the property line dividing us. If I don't know where that property line is, then when he begins to encroach on my property and spread his lawn furniture there and so forth, I can't defend my property and tell him to stop if I don't even know where that line exists. And if you look at the state of public education today, specifically civic education, and the understanding that the average high school graduate or college graduate or 30 or 40 or 50-year-old American has about our rights, it's pathetic, right? It's so substandard. And no wonder that we don't understand where to defend our rights and where to hold the government in check, because collectively the public simply doesn't understand and doesn't know. So, hashtag Tubblecamp, that's another reason why we do those books. Okay, another thing that I'm really concerned about after COVID-19 is, in this new normal, is the Karen effect, I'll call it. Is the degree to which we are shaming one another right now, right? You are insufficiently compliant with the mandate from said government official, therefore I'm going to record you and shame you on Twitter, and my 20,000 people are going to all like it, and we're going to cancel you, right? Cancel culture, what that is, right? You're going to lose your job, and everyone's going to know you're a horrible person, and now when people on Tinder are looking you up to see if you're a scary person, they're going to see how horrible you are, and you're never going to get married, and life is going to be horrible. So I am appalled and so perplexed at what the next step and what the long-term consequences of this are. Because I don't think we've ever really had this experiment in American society where there's this kind of lateral effect, right, of shaming one another. I mean, I had that neighbor one time who called the cops on the other neighbor because they had weeds that were longer than a foot. And I'm like, why don't you just go over there and pull them? Or maybe she's pregnant or dying or so the cops come out. I'm like, what are you, anyways. So there's always people like that, right? But now it's just so prevalent, and social media is exacerbating it. And for those of us, look, we're all literally in a room, and I'd say 95% of people are choosing not to wear masks, and that's fine. I won't complain. I'm 6 feet away from all of you. So if this gets out on social media, some people record it, you're all in trouble, and I'm not. But you're all grown-ups, and you don't wear face diapers, and more power to you. But the point is that the mob goes nuts about this kind of stuff. And those who go against the grain, those who think and act independently, those who question sources of authority, even public health officials, and the data that who knows if it's accurate and all these kinds of things. Now those of you and us who dare to push back against that narrative, there's this mob ready to attack. And there's no compassion, there's no humility, there's no seeking of understanding, there's no tolerance, which is insane because, I thought the left, which is instigating most of this, is all about tolerance, but whatever. They're not consistent, I will at least concede that. But the Karen effect really scares me about what is next. The last thing I'll add is, and it's not quite COVID so much as it is the parallel kind of policing issue, which is really prevalent right now. We just did and released a poll, so if you go to libertusutah.org, you can find the poll results. There's a lot of concern right now about racism in policing, excessive force, and all this kind of stuff. And so this issue has kind of come parallel to COVID. Apparently you can't catch COVID if you're protesting outside. But, you can't go worship in church apparently, but you can, worship, I don't know what, democratic socialism in the streets. But that's going to be another big topic for the legislature as we move forward, and so that's something that we're tackling. So I thought I'd tack that on the end. I am usually an optimist, especially because of the Tuttle twins. It's very much kind of inspired me to be more optimistic about the future and see so many kids and frankly their parents learning these ideas and trying to get that better foundation so that they do know where that line is, so that when it comes time for them to resist or make a decision or flee California, like some that they'll be better to do so. I'll tell you, when I watch the news, I am depressed as all get out. And that's intentional. Again, read the book. And so I don't watch national news. I haven't had cable in 20 years, and it's been the best decision ever because they want us to be scared. We make horrible choices when we're scared. We do not assert our freedoms when we're scared. We seek a savior when we're scared. And most of us, even the Christians among us, or the faithful or religious among us, seek the fleshy arm of Caesar when we're scared, instead of, perhaps where we ought to go. And so this is all very intentional. If you've never read a book called Propaganda by Edward Bernays, I would add that to your little Amazon wish list. Feel free to pull out your phone, I'm not offended at all. Propaganda is so enlightening. This was written in the 1920s. This was a guy who worked with Woodrow Wilson. He was one of the first public relations guys in America. His uncle was Sigmund Freud, right? Understanding kind of neuroscience and psychology. And he writes this book, Propaganda, talking about how easily manipulated the masses can be. How, in fact, it is the minority of people that control the majority, and he called it an invisible government constituted of people who are pulling the strings. This was literally a century ago. And if this was happening in like 1920s America, good grief, folks, it's happening today. And so the hard thing, I think, for folks like us is trying to understand to what extent and in which situations stuff like that is happening. Because standing up for our rights is important, teaching our kids is important, holding our government accountable is important. And even and especially when the mob disagrees, and when groupthink is in action, these are scary times, they're uncertain times. When I do like 80 Zoom calls a day, it seems like now, with all these like meetings and stuff. And everyone always asks like, oh, how are you doing today, right? How's it going? And I always say like, do you want the real answer, or do you want like the polite, oh, I'm great, how are you, right? And the real answer is like, man, today I'm all right, but yesterday, holy, like it feels like the tectonic plates underneath us are like shifting like crazy right now. And so I think it's very important for us to be on guard. Appreciate you guys coming. I've been blabbing a lot. I'm gonna end it there. I'll be happy to kind of chat with you guys in some Q&A. So yes, ma'am, we'll start with
Can I
you.
just make a comment? I went to 3 places where masks were required. I didn't. I went to 3 places where masks were required. I did not wear a mask. At one point, a lady was sort of like, "Ben, you need to put your mask on," but I just kept going. And at Costco, I was with the eye doctor, and we're checking out, and I said, "Does it bother you that I'm not wearing a mask?" And they all said no. There was another gal in Costco with her daughter. She refused to wear a mask, and she was shopping. So I think if we can just, even though it says by, Smith, same thing. I went to Smith's, went shopping, didn't wear a mask. I think we need to at least make that effort. If we just assume, oh my gosh, it says I need to wear a mask, I better wear a mask. No, we're just be part of the sheeple. We need to really make our statement, be polite about it, and I was. And I went to a doctor facility. She put her gun to my, I call it the gun to your head, getting us used to a gun to our head, so I put my finger to her forehead. And she was like, "What are you doing?" And I just had a smile. And then she said, "Oh, your temperature's over, it was like 110 outside." She said, "Oh, you're over 100, you just sit down over there." I just went to the elevator, pushed the button, and went up. I'm just saying, we don't have to be sheeple.
Talk to me later. We'll draw up the adoption paperwork. He can be my new adopted mom. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. You are doing amazing, and I so appreciate it. And I hear all this stuff, and it's like when our president or different announcing, we've got to fight for what's right, got to do this, what would you suggest as common vote we can do that is the best thing to help everything that's going on, other than just being frustrated?
Great question. The question is, what can the average Joe do rather than just be frustrated? What can actually be done? The first thing I would say is, so our group is responsible for passing the medical marijuana law in Utah, and some of you will say congrats, and others will say shame on you, but whatever. It is what it is. We passed the medical marijuana law in Utah, and The way we got that done is by, and I'll even back up, we actually mimicked the LGBT community. The reason why LGBT rights have just totally shifted in one direction is for one reason and one reason alone. And that is the comfort level of individuals in that community to be public about themselves. Because in a very short amount of time, when all these stories were coming out, suddenly everyone had a coworker and an uncle and then sister-in-law and it personalized that issue for so many people that there was kind of a tipping point. We did the same exact thing with medical cannabis. We did a big campaign to identify patients, and we had them and helped them share their stories and be public. It normalized the issue, it personalized and individualized the issue to the point where the polling just drastically shifted. I bring that all up because I think one of the best things people can be doing right now is being public with their rational, calm thinking. I called it panic porn. There's just like this fear disease going around, and so many people are so scared. And I know a few people that I'm thinking of right now that I think exemplify this well. They're on Facebook, they're on Instagram, they're on, whatever. And they're just calm. And they're talking about the data. They're talking about the competing claims. Well, the CDC said masks aren't the good idea. Now they're saying they are. And they said we can't get it on contact surfaces. And then they said, simply calmly present. You can't be conspiratorial. You can't be fringy. You can't be rabid. Right? Because imagine if someone came to you 10 years ago before you were woke like you are now, right? And someone tries to cram all this stuff down your throat. You're going to be like, whoa, hey, I don't want to be around you. You're crazy, right? And we're all crazy. So we need to temper our craziness. But I think the best thing that can be happening right now is simply be public with your thoughts. Be willing to engage publicly, because I've seen so many times in the past few weeks when there's a Facebook thread, for example, that's going kind of crazy. And someone gets on there and kind of brings the mood down. I will see people who previously were kind of shouting at one another say, oh, no, I'm sorry, you're right, I got a little too hot-headed, you do have this right, I do concede this, you're right about that. And all of a sudden it goes back to rational debate. So I think the more that we can engage like that, the better. I do think there's room right now for some civil disobedience. I am not going to rule out that as an inappropriate thing. I will quibble maybe a little bit with private businesses. As much as I don't like Costco and Target and so forth doing it, I believe they have that right. I do think they're playing into the overall, stupidity and overreaction, especially like, okay, when the death rate was here, we were all walking around Costco just fine, and now that the death rate is down here, you're shutting everything down, you're kind of dumb. But I think they have that right. I think our civil disobedience and resistance needs to be as much as possible to the government, rather than to private businesses.
Just one point on
defend yourself.
I would always say to somebody, does it bother you? And when I was checking out of Costco, I said to the young man that, how they help you kind of check out, does it bother you that I'm not wearing a mask? I was always polite and I always asked them. And when they said no, then it was okay.
Sure. Yeah.
I wasn't out there being aggressively, I'm not going to wear it,
I appreciate that clarification. I was more thinking of, there's a group up north that has been staging apparently weekly, they call them flash mobs, but no one's flashing anyone and there's no dancing or anything. And so they just all descend on a grocery store that has said masks, and they try and make a stunt, and anyways. So I think some civil disobedience is appropriate. I think political pressure is always very helpful right now on your specifically your legislators. I would be texting them, I would be emailing them. Again, you don't want to be crazy, because there's some legislators who, when they get crazy emails, they will go on Twitter and screenshot and say, look at this crazy email. You don't want to be that person where they're like plastering you on social media. I just saw one of those today. But be rational, be persuasive. Think about what you need to do and say to persuade someone else. And just engage, because the biggest problem I have in what I do, honestly, is that I know there's so many people out there who agree with what we're doing and the way we think and so forth, but they're quiet. And the people who are most vocal are the people who say that individual self-reliance is whiteness that should be opposed for some reason, right? Like, those are the people who are vocal, and so I think those of us who believe in freedom need to be a little more vocal. Sir.
And to piggyback off of this, for those of us, and maybe some of you feel the same way, what would be your suggestions for when we're engaged in emotional fatigue? We've defended, we're hitting these walls with our loved ones, people we do not want to offend, family, friends who are not woke or are not progressed as far along on the liberty spectrum, or could quite possibly have an entirely different worldview, especially with this BLM argument. Are there coping mechanisms or something constructive we can do when we're engaged in that emotional fatigue, where I admit I'm guilty of just saying I'm going to be apathetic right now, I'm going to be a 1960s hippie and just chill.
Not Netflix and chill, just chill. So to that I would say, and speaking from personal experience, having alienated initially many people years ago, that I had to repair those relationships and so forth. I used to be kind of the machine gun keyboard warrior, right? Like, I saw this comic once, I have it saved because it epitomizes what Connor 10 years ago used to be like. And it's this guy sitting at a computer, and it's dark, right? And the glow from the computer's in his face, and a little peak of light comes in the corner, the door is open back in the corner, and the wife is peeking her head in and saying, "Honey, it's late, come to bed." Has anyone seen this? No? Okay. And the guy says, "Not now. Someone's wrong on the internet." So that was me a decade ago, and I was forcing it down everyone's throats, and I was vocal, and I was, and so maybe to kind of bridge both of these questions, what I would say in response is, just speaking only from personal experience, what I have seen a huge benefit of is having my own platform. This can be a blog, like for me in 2005 and 6 it started as a blog. It can be a blog, it can be a podcast, it can be a book club, it can be weekly Facebook Live videos where you just chat with people who want to come on, right? Endless options, letters to the editor, whatever. Find an outlet to speak your truth, to use something that the left says, to share your thoughts, because then what I've seen when I've done that in the past is the family members and others who disagreed with me or were kind of fed up with me, they could just ignore that outlet. And I wouldn't be the guy at dinner table where I'm always like injecting into the conversation. But Project for a New American Century said we need a new Pearl Harbor. So you don't want to do that. Your family will know that here's your thoughts. They'll get curious once in a while, right? Like my mom, when I wrote my first book, Latter-day Liberty, which is about why the gospel of Jesus Christ supports a libertarian political stance or meshes best with it compared to any other political philosophy. So that was my first book in like 2011. I read this book, and my mom literally thought I was crazy. Grew up in a Republican conservative household, whatever, like she told me I was crazy. Now, my mom calls herself a libertarian and shares the book with all her friends. So some of this stuff just takes time, which is unfortunate because a lot of times we feel like we don't have time. But I would say have your own outlet where you can focus on putting out what you want to do, because you are going to then not alienate those relationships. They'll know where to find your thoughts if they want to find it. But also, you're going to build an audience of other people who you never would have reached before. And what I've seen from doing this over the years is that there's so many people who are, the term online is lurkers. They're lurking, right? They're not engaging in that debate, or they're not, whatever. But they're just reading everything, and they're learning, and they're observing. And I've had so many people over the years that have said, yeah, I'm shy, or I have thin skin, I didn't want to engage, but I really appreciate what you're doing because I've learned so much, blah, 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 you totally changed my mind. So there's so many people out there that we can influence outside of our immediate, intimate relationships that we don't want to, cause problems with. I subscribe to this idea of we should be anxiously engaged, bringing about much righteousness of our own, free will and so forth. And so I think projects like that, outlets like that, allow us to, preach the truth and spread the word without kind of causing some of the problems. So for whatever it's worth, perhaps there's an idea. Yes, sir.
That's a really pertinent point, because you talked about fear earlier being a major factor in what's going on right now. It's also the polarization. Everything is stagnant. People cannot move past where they're at, and we're all divided. And that's being whipped up by government and bureaucracy and the media. But I noticed that the sheeple, they live in an echo chamber. They don't really have access to anything that other thoughts. So your point of being comfortable with yourself is really important. I saw that situation today where somebody was vehemently for masks and stuff, and I talked with her, another person talked with her a little bit, and I could tell that she had never heard this. And she was a younger person. And if we don't reach out to the younger generation, we are complete.
Yeah.
I mean, if they can buy into this, all this. But yeah, be comfortable with yourself and talk to people, don't be afraid of it. But do it in a really rational, educational, respectful way.
That's a great point. So being comfortable with yourself, and that's where I think some of these projects can, in a controlled environment, can be better for the average Joe or Jane just getting into an issue. Because rather than dipping your toe into a social media debate where you're worried about 80 people piling on you and canceling you, right? If you instead say, I am going to start a podcast, or I am going to start a discussion group with people in my neighborhood, or I, right, am going to invite people over for dinner. Two couples in the neighborhood, and Saturday nights we'll have dinner night at my house. We've done this, and it's great because you're exposing all these people in a way that you have this interpersonal relationship, and it's not just this online thing. And so you can be far more comfortable with yourself, I feel like, in those controlled circumstances where you're not worried what someone's going to do online to attack you. Yes, sir.
Did you say you homeschool?
Yes.
Have you made any attempt at all to try and opt out of your paying school taxes?
Well, we're trying to pass a law to allow for that to happen, and there are some things I could get into, but specifically no. So is that, do you have more to ask or add?
No.
Okay, so what I would say is for those, to expound on that, in Utah there's a couple online charter schools where homeschoolers who want money will enroll. So technically they're not homeschoolers at that point, they're charter school students, which is just government school with a different shade of lipstick on it. And however, the way it works is that this company, this online charter school, will give you, the parent, money for your child that you can use for certain educational expenses. So some homeschoolers, families like this because it's a way for them to get some money back. They're not actually, they feel like they're homeschooling because this online charter school is very kind of laissez-faire. It's much more loosey-goosey than, an actual charter school. So they feel like they're homeschooling, but they get some money. As I said, we're trying to change the law to provide a tax credit so that homeschoolers can keep more. 100% of the state income tax in Utah goes to the government education system, 100%. And so because of that, we're trying to change it so that homeschoolers, private schoolers who have actual education out-of-pocket expenses can pay less income tax, not receive a stipend or a subsidy from the state, but keep more of their money. Now, I think education, just like garbage services, should be a user fee. And if you want to have 10 kids, more power to you, but you shouldn't be able to force taxpayers to subsidize your decision, right? Whereas if you had 2 kids, it would be cheaper for taxpayers. But hey, I'm going to have all the babies in the world, and everyone else will pay for it for me. So many people say they don't support socialism, but they actually support socialism. Fancy that. So I think education should be a user fee. If you want to benefit from the government services, just like your trash can, I think I'm not equating kids with trash. I'm going to get a tweet later about that or something. But anyway, so there's some limited options. We're trying to expand on them. We did just pass the special needs scholarships. So starting next year when it's implemented, kids with special needs will be able to come out of public school and get $5,000 to $7,000 for education. Special needs is kind of fairly broadly defined. Anyone who would qualify for an IEP, individualized education program. So that's another option for the special needs kids. But I think far more needs to be done. Sir, before you, I need to go to this gal over here on the front row.
Okay, so my question is, what are you going to do, because already we're the state of Utah, I'm on the state school board, and already the state of Utah is going after what's called a Rethinking Education grant from the federal government. Betsy DeVos already talked about that if the schools aren't allowed to open, then what we need to do with that money is allow parents to take it and use it where they feel best, which I'm like wolf sheep's clothing, because that's going to come with a lot of strings attached. So I understand what you're wanting to do, the opt-out or tax credit or what have you, and still on the fence with that, but I am looking at it. I like that a lot better. But this is already rolling forward. I mean, we're already turning in our application.
Yeah, feels like Common Core all over again.
Yes.
where the state is seduced by money into pursuing a horrible outcome. So yes, the biggest concern when it comes to education funding is the strings that are attached. As I said at the beginning, we homeschoolers are especially nervous about Sauron's eye, pointing to our camp and seeing, you're not, anyways, coming after us. So we don't want those regulations. The tax credit, look, most of us have taken the child tax credit, right? I have some kids, I pay less taxes because, my service to America, I guess. And the child tax credit, for example, has not led to an incursion against parental rights, right? Keeping more of your money, if anything, it would just be later when you're audited, which hardly anyone is. And one great thing about the Trump administration is basically starving the IRS, where they basically have no more auditors, which is really fun. So only in a tax audit would they you inappropriately took the tax credit, or the tax credit is a model in which it doesn't really lead to strings because it's people on their own checking the box when they fill out their forms and simply sending in a little bit less money. So that's why I feel safer about that model in particular, because you don't really see with other tax credits any type of nexus where regulators can attach requirements to it. However, the fear is, outside of the tax credit issue, that if we have this massive influx of homeschoolers, the schooling do-gooders are going to say, well, we need to regulate because there's just so many of them. Before, when there were hardly any, we didn't care because it was just this tiny minority. But now that an eighth of kids in Utah are being homeschooled, we need to be confident that they're learning. To which I say, did you see the last few months? And it was just ridiculous. No one was learning anything. So, trying to remember what the question is. Oh yeah, so the state trying to get the money. So that is the problem when, vouchers. This is one of the biggest problems with vouchers a decade ago, is when people want to go to a private school and take taxpayer money with them. Do you remember this? The legislature passed vouchers, the NEA dumped $2 million into Utah and got the voters to overturn it. But the problem with vouchers is you're getting taxpayer money for benefit. And so there's actually a fairly legitimate argument to make that strings follow where you're wanting taxpayers to subsidize your activity, which is why the safest thing I think for the homeschool, alternative education, etc. community is to just say, leave me alone, just let me keep more of my money rather than this kind of double dang effect.
But can that coexist with the rethinking grant that's being pushed?
I haven't read the details, so I honestly don't know. Please do. Please do that, Dear, and I would love to. Okay, sir, you were next.
All right. All this problem that we're having are basically, they've turned the whole country into statutory regulations instead of the Constitution. And that's why it's wiping us right out. And who's willing? They're leading, okay? I've had a talk even with Orrin Hatch, he ran away from me. And I went to the senator and congressman, and I had a 5th District Court judge one time put a guy in jail illegally. I went right into his office, put my nose right to his nose, and said, you put him in illegally. He says, well, what can I do? I have to make a living. I said, you raise your right hand. You said you would solemnly swear to uphold the Constitution. Anyway, open the whole court up and let him out.
To which I would say they swear, these congressmen do swear not to uphold the Constitution, but getting back to the line analogy, how many of them have actually been read the document that they're pledging? You got Mike Lee and Rand Paul and Thomas Massey and maybe a handful of others, apart from that. And I'll just have to say one other funny thing. You talk about Orrin Hatch, you said he ran away from you, to which I would add, at least he didn't want to punch you in the nose, because when he was running for re-election, he had this, quote, he was so ticked off at the libertarian, I'm going to punch him in the nose. And anyways, that was when we were trying to, I had a website, this was 2016, I think, something like that, might have been 2014. So we basically booted Bob Bennett out of office. We got Mike Lee, I was on Mike Lee's campaign. It was a shock to the establishment that Bob Bennett lost, right, if you remember at the time, which is what led to Count My Vote and SB 54 and all this kind of stuff. And so when we went after Orrin Hatch next, they were freaking out. I had a website called dethroneorrinhatch.com. That was a lot of fun, and I had all kinds of Photoshop memes, and that was back in my machine gun politics, you're all wrong kind of era. The website no longer exists, but maybe on the Internet Archive you can find it. Yes, sir. Question.
Well, never heard this idea brought out before, but knowing how the left likes to dumb down our school children, you make them dumb so they have to be led. Well, this closing the school kind of falls right into that, where if they close it for a year, then your senior in high school is no longer 18, he's 19, he's an adult. How often is a 19-year-old going to want to hang around and go through high school? So if they get 20% of them to say, oh, bag it, I don't need it, and walk away, they've affected the school system and the educational level. And it doesn't do it for just 1 year, it does it for 12, because we've got 12 years worth of kids in the system that are all going to be older because of that shutdown. Is that a possibility?
So that's a great question. I think what's more likely to happen for the seniors is that they're going to be pushing them either to kind of early graduation or taking the GED. Right? I don't think that they're going to say, okay, you all need to come back and like redo another year or anything like that. I do know that a lot of folks in the different school districts are very cognizant of these types of problems. And that's why I think there's going to be kind of this more systemic transformation, because they're trying, like, okay, here's a perfect example. I got an email yesterday from a mom who sent an email to her school, to the principal secretary, saying, hey, we're homeschooling. The secretary replied and said, the principal has asked, and you could clearly tell that like this was a copy and paste that they send to everyone in the circumstance. The principal has requested that I provide you with some alternatives to consider before you withdraw your child from school. We're very concerned, and we want to make sure that best thing can be done for your child. And so here's some of the things. Come talk to us. Maybe we, and they're trying to like prevent this exodus from the public school system because they're worried in a lot of respects about what that's going to be. However, the one thing that the education system, and I hesitate to even call it the education system, it's a schooling system. The schooling system has long needed competition. We all talk about how awful monopolies are, and yet, we have this basically quasi-monopoly. And so the best thing that can happen for the school system is competition, which again is the silver lining I feel like right now, because so many people are going to leave the system, even if only temporarily, that they're going to experiment with all kinds of alternatives that are going to put market pressure, right, on the public school system to try and innovate and adapt. And so they're going to have to accommodate stuff like this. I don't think it's going to be this like chaotic thing that you're referring to, because the easiest thing at the end of the day is to just pull the child out in the senior year or whatever year and go take a GED and be done with it, as many people are.
How well does the GED get you into college?
How well does the GED get you to college? So to that I would say just fine. There are many people. Yeah.
How well does college prepare you for actual life?
So
Other than
you're plugging a book we did last year called Skip College. You can find that on Amazon. A nice bold title. That was a fun one to write as a college graduate. But yeah, people with GEDs can get into college, but people without GEDs and college diplomas are getting jobs left and right just fine, or even better, going out and start their own. I need to look for, how much time do we have? When do we need to? Okay, we'll take a few more questions. Let's do, is there anyone I haven't talked to yet, just so I'm happy to, okay, go ahead.
In terms of the education and taxes and governor with the mask, I think don't ever underestimate the arrogance of our bureaucracy and our legal cycles. They tend to want to go towards more control. We tend to want to go towards less control. And I don't see anything mixing, except that you stand up and you be strong about yourself and you be vocal and you organize. That's probably the most important thing, is everybody in this room here might think the same thing on one issue, but there's no organization on that one issue. So like without that, that's the one thing that the left has, is they are afraid to organize.
Yeah, we need a community organizing on the right, and I just decided I'm standing here from now on. So I'm gonna make a friend.
You're not 16.
Yeah, I'll be all right. Go ahead.
How much should government be involved in the public health?
How much should government be involved in public health? So that's a great question. From our review of the law, and I guess just a bit of common sense, our proposals, we're talking with legislators, is that public health officials should have no power. They should have only advisory recommendations to elected officials who have at least some theoretical accountability to voters. So in other words, a public health official shouldn't be able to quarantine Larry over here in the corner and put him in a bubble with Netflix and Amazon. But he should be able to go to the mayor and make a case and say, we have these reasons to believe that, you know, Larry is infectious and blah, blah, blah. And it should be up to someone with a little bit of voter accountability to be able to make a decision. So these public health officials, no one knows who they are, no one had any say in the matter of who was hired, there's no due process, there's none of this. And so I'm all for information. I'm all for public health officials being able to say, here's our concerns. You're all adults. If you want to wear face diapers, go for it. If you don't, then that's fine too. But here's information to empower you to make decisions and use your agency. And again, with the kind of presumption of innocence and the narrow particularity of problems,